Hey guys, it's Dr. Tatiana Karaskia, founder of Being Well LLC, and I just wanted to say happy National Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. We love you, we honor you, we thank you, and in honor of this special month, I created a presentation outlining the mental health issues that exist within the Asian American and Pacific Islander community that I recently presented for the National Alliance on Mental Illness chapter in Mobile. I wanted to share that presentation, so here it is, and I hope you enjoy. Oh, and before I forget, I'm actually wearing a shirt from Hawaii in honor of this month as well. So thank you guys. We love you once again, and I hope you enjoy this presentation. I'd love to hear any thoughts, any comments that you have, and definitely any feedback is welcome. So hope you enjoy. Well, hi guys. Thank you for that introduction. So once again, my name is Dr. Tatiana Karaskia. I am a family medicine doctor, and I'm actually the founder of Being Well LLC, which is a mental health initiative aimed at increasing mental health care to underprivileged populations. So in that vein, today our presentation is called Minorities in Mental Health Care. As you may or may not know, this month is actually National Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. So we celebrate you. It actually also is Mental Health Awareness Month. So in that vein, it's the perfect collision of our two worlds. I'm going to dedicate this presentation to our Asian American and Pacific Islander colleagues, and we're going to talk about their mental health. So I just want to start out by saying this presentation was not easy. I've done a lot of presentations. This one specifically was really hard for me to organize and to prepare. And one of the main reasons was that the data that discuss mental health trends in this cohort is not very robust. The data exists, it's just not a lot is out there, it's not very accessible. So you really have to be a scientist or have access to published articles to be able to see a lot of the articles, not just be out in the open as a layperson. And a lot of the articles are not up to date. There's a lot of outdated material out there that talks about these issues. Furthermore, Asian American and Pacific Islander, it's a big umbrella term. So to subcategorize that and then do studies within each category, Koreans, Japanese, Hawaiians, each different culture, it's huge. It's super important, and it's a disservice to lump them all together in all of the studies that are conducted. So we need further studies that look into each culture and their unique mental health issues. And finally, it was tricky because I myself am not Asian American or Pacific Islander, so I had to learn a lot about that culture and a lot about different trends in mental health within that culture, and it was quite eye-opening for me. So again, why is this important? I think it goes without saying that Asian Americans are instrumental in our country and our culture. There are 20.6 million plus people in the United States who identify as Asian, Native Hawaiian, or other Pacific Islander alone. That's not in combination with other races. There's over 500,000 Asian and Pacific Island or Native Hawaiian owned businesses. Just Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander veterans, there are over 35,000 in the US. And again, API culture is deeply ingrained in American culture. So if you've ever had Chinese food, if you've ever had Indian food, if you've ever done yoga, meditation, Tai Chi, if you've ever seen a Jackie Chan or Bruce Lee movie, if you've ever heard of Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, really, if you've ever been to Hawaii, you get a lot of sense of that culture. So, it is prevalent, those cultures, they are prevalent within our own American culture, and they're deeply intertwined with American culture. And most importantly, too, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are actually the fastest growing racial group in the United States. So that's something really important to know as well. So this slide wants to ask you guys, what is the mental health state of API and why is it important to you? So we'll start the poll and I will post the results at the end. And I'd really like to know personally, why is this important to you? So I just talked about, why is it important for the general population? Obviously there's a lot of reasons, but for you personally and specifically, do you know anybody who identifies as API? Do you yourself identify as API? Is your partner your doctor, your best friend, whatever it may be for you? Have you known somebody who suffered from mental illness who belonged to this category? Or are you a provider who has seen somebody in this category? All right, so let's take a step back and just talk about mental health care, majority and minorities, and I'm going to give you some definitions. I just want to start off by saying, baseline, everyone could benefit from mental health care services. Every single person, whether you're technically a majority in the mental health care world, the majority that seek mental health care, or you're a minority, somebody who might not seek it, utilize it, or maybe even need it as much, everyone could benefit from it. And that's for many different reasons: for preventative, for stress management, wellness, for mental illness, for having a dedicated space to just talk to somebody about your thoughts, feelings, setting a foundation for your future, getting to know yourself better. And in that same vein, everyone could benefit, but it is very crucial to discuss these inequalities in mental health care access so that we can learn about them and we can do something about them, and we can make sure that we increase access to those minorities who might not have access. So I want to pose a question to set the foundation for the rest of this discussion. And this question is, are there any groups that have less access to mental health care services? That's really the key question that we're asking here. And again, just to go over some basic definitions that most people know. What is a majority? So very simply, a majority typically in terms of a population, it's the greater part, the greater number, versus a minority, which is typically the smaller parts or the smaller numbers that make up some count. I want to introduce a new definition. This is my own definition of what is a minority in mental health care. So what I like to define a minority in mental health care is a group in a subset of individuals. So within a larger group of individuals who all need or seek mental health care, who is less likely to obtain or maintain adequate mental health care due to a number of factors. So this is within people who need or seek mental health care, those who are less likely to obtain it or maintain it for a number of reasons. And we're going to talk about this, so remember this definition. So in regards to majorities, or the majority in mental health care, there's a certain stereotype that is very prevalent when we talk about a majority. So I'm going to show you some images, and I want you to let me know your thoughts. When you Google mental health, the main propaganda, the main ads, the main pictures that we see when looking up mental health are what I would describe as very colorful. I would even say they're pretty. I would even say they're feminine. And in fact, they have women in a lot of the pictures. Then when you Google wellness, it seems to be a similar pattern. You see a lot of colors. I would describe them again as pretty, and I would say they have feminine qualities to them. And lastly, when you Google mindfulness, once again, colorful, and they tend to be feminine. They have women predominantly in a lot of the advertisement. So this is a direct reflection of the majority in mental health care. The ads, the propaganda, the images that depict, that personify, if you will, mental health care, tend to be aimed at this majority. And as you can guess, this majority is females, typically young, between the ages of 18 to 50 or so, and they're usually Caucasian. And this isn't bad. This is a reflection of the majority. This isn't inherently a bad thing. However, this can be very marginalizing to other communities. So those who aren't the majority, imagine a middle-aged African-American male looking up mental health or wellness and seeing these images. They might be a little bit off-putting or not as appealing to him. Or a adolescent Hispanic male who's also looking. A middle-aged Asian American or Pacific Islander male as well. Probably if they're searching and they see this, they won't be as attracted. So that's something else to keep in mind. So we've talked about the majority. Now let's talk about the minorities in healthcare. Specifically, we're going to focus today on Asian American and Pacific Islanders. I want you to take a look at this image. And this is a graph from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA. And they did a study that looked at data from 2015 to 2019. They sent out surveys to the general US population, and what they did was look at mental health service trends within the US, and they divided this into different ethnicities or races. And what you can see here is mental health service use in the past year among adults. The most common ethnicity to utilize mental health services were whites, as we just talked about, Caucasian population. They further divide this into male and females, and by far the majority were also females, but we're going to focus just on the ethnicities. So Caucasians or whites are the most likely to utilize mental health services in the study. The least likely, the minority in utilization, are Asian Americans and Native Hawaiians or Pacific Islanders. So we see that more than any other minority, more than Hispanics, more than biracial, more than African Americans or Black Americans, they are the least likely to utilize mental health services. And this includes any type of service, whether it's medication, outpatient, inpatient, any of the above. So looking at this, you might assume that they utilize mental health care services less, maybe because they have less mental illness, maybe because there's less of a need. That's fair. Now this data takes a look at that, and we can see here that it supports that. So this is any mental illness in the past year among adults, again divided by race and ethnicity, and this is serious mental illness to the right. And we see that Native Hawaiians or Pacific Islanders and Asian Americans have the least, if not are definitely among the least, to have mental illness. And this is any mental illness and serious mental illness. Especially Asian Americans, they are the lowest likelihood to have any mental illness or serious mental illness. So, okay, you're thinking this kind of correlates. They don't use services as much. The data also show that they seem to have less mental or serious mental illness. Makes sense, problem solved. End of presentation. Not quite. So let's take a look at mental health service use among those who do. So yes, there might be less. Let's go with that for now. But among those who did say that they had mental illness or even serious mental illness, how many of them actually seek out help? How many are using mental health services? And again, this is alarming. We see that the least likely to utilize mental health services are Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islanders and Asians. And here on the right, they did not show the Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander populations because there wasn't enough data. But we do see that, again, even within those who have mental illness to different degrees, they still didn't utilize mental health services as much. They were the least likely to utilize them. And again, this is any type of mental health services, prescription, outpatient, or inpatient services. This is, once again, alarming. The question then becomes why? Why are they not utilizing mental health care services as much as other ethnicities when we know they need it? So we see here the different reasons for that lack of utilization, and they divided it on the left, starting with unmet need, and on the right for any mental illness who had an unmet need. Unmet need meaning in the last 12 months you had the feeling of needing mental health services, whatever that could mean to you, but you decided not to utilize it at that time for whatever reason that could be. So we see the major reasons, and on the left side, again, we don't have, unfortunately, Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander here, but we do see the trends in Asians. And on the left side, the bars are the black bars are the Asian category, and in the right side, the green bars are the Asian category. So we see that cost is a major factor, actually. We see that stigma is a huge factor, especially for those with mental illness, unfortunately. That's a big factor for them not utilizing mental health services. And then we also see that a really big one is structural barriers. So things like transportation or lack thereof, things like having no idea where to seek services or not knowing who is providing the services, not finding them convenient enough. Those are some structural barriers that were presented. And lastly, some of them, not as commonly, but some of them just said that there was a low perceived need, meaning although they had mental illness, although they had an unmet need, it wasn't in their top priorities to obtain mental health care services. Now, look at the bottom. That doesn't mean that they didn't think they would help them, that there would be any benefit. So we see that in this category, did not think treatment would help, and that's pretty low. It is a little bit higher within Asians, but it's low compared to the other reasons that were given. So the majority thought that they would help, but there was something else that was blocking that access, whether it was cost, structural barriers, or stigma or low perceived need. Now, I do also want to point out that the most common reasons here, and that's really for any ethnicity, the most common reasons were cost or structural barriers. And I think that that's a big, big tragedy. That's a huge tragedy, because that's something that we can all affect as the providers. We can all influence, not 100%, but we certainly can affect cost and we can affect structural barriers. So something to think about, and we're going to talk about it a little bit more. All right, and the last piece of data that I'm going to show you is reasons for not using mental health services among adults with serious mental illness and, again, who had an unmet need. And the patterns remain. So we see, again, cost is among the biggest. It's actually the biggest one here, with structural barriers being a close second. Big tragedy, because these are all factors that we can affect. Stigma being a huge one, and the biggest one within all ethnicities for Asians was stigma. And then low perceived need as well wasn't quite a priority. So the most important ones that we can think about for Asians, and really for any ethnicity, were cost and structural barriers. One of the biggest ones for Asians specifically was stigma, and low perceived need not being quite a priority was also prevalent. Now let's take a step back. I just gave you a lot of data, a lot of information. I want to take a step back, and I want to know what your thoughts are about the information that I presented. So let me know, was this something that you are shocked about? Was this something that you are neutral, no current thoughts, maybe processing right now? Is this something that you expected? Is this something that does not alarm you? Let me know your thoughts. I'd like to hear what you're thinking about everything as you're kind of learning, as you're seeing this, and as you're processing it. And we'll talk about this at the end of the presentation. All right. So the data that I just presented, that was from surveys that were conducted within the years of 2015 and 2019. Then, throwing a huge wrench into all of this, there was a huge event that happened in 2020, which was the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, let's talk about how the COVID-19 pandemic affected specifically Asian Americans' mental health. So obviously, this pandemic worsened everybody's mental health across the board globally. However, in addition to affecting mental health, Asian Americans experienced way increased rates of discrimination and hate crimes, both verbally as well as physically. And actually also, according to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, they were more likely to experience job loss and financial hardship than any other racial group during the pandemic. On top of that, these issues, everything else that we've talked about, they're not new. They emerged a little bit during the COVID pandemic, and it became a topic of conversation and something that we addressed as a community a little bit, but it's not something that's new. It's not something that started during the COVID pandemic. So things like exclusionary immigration policies, internment, or this idea of being in prison camps, the stresses associated with this idea of a model minority, which we're going to talk about a little bit more, other stereotypes, and then this acculturation, this idea of assimilating into a different culture and trying to fit in. So how did the COVID-19 pandemic affect the mental health of API adolescents specifically? This is also a tragic slide. So data show that rising rates, they show that the rates are rising of suicide death among Asian and Pacific Islander adolescents since 2020, and that actually, even more alarming, suicides were the leading cause of death among Asian and Pacific Islander adolescents in 2020, and those rates more than doubled in this population in the last 10 years or so, between 2010 and 2020. So that is huge, 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 very, very alarming. So how did the COVID-19 pandemic affect API young adults and their mental health? So this is another study that was actually conducted in 2020 during the pandemic, and it was surveys sent out to Asian American and Pacific Islander university students in 29 universities across the US. And they correlated COVID-19 related racial discrimination with mental health outcomes. So what they saw was those participants who responded to having felt COVID-19 related racial discrimination had much higher rates of depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation, as well as self-injury and binge drinking. So we actually see that those that responded they had faced discrimination had twice the rates of depression and anxiety, as well as suicidal ideation, and increased rates again of binge drinking and self-injury. So we saw this direct correlation, this direct relationship between the pandemic and much worsening mental health among young adults because of this discrimination. Now, with all of that in mind, so just having discussed how COVID affected everybody's mental health, how Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders were much more affected than arguably anybody else during the COVID pandemic, and data show that their mental health went down substantially during COVID due to a number of reasons, some of which included discrimination, hate crimes, etc. Even with all of that, we still see the data show that Asian Americans are still less likely to receive mental health services. And this shows adults who, again, have mental illness post-pandemic in 2021. And it shows who received mental health services. And again, Asians are the least likely of any ethnicity to seek mental health services, even with everything we just talked about. So again, tragic slide, another tragic slide. So let's summarize everything we talked about. So prior to COVID-19, API seemed, which said, we saw some data, they seem to have lower rates of mental illness and or serious mental illness than any other racial group in the US, and I'm going to challenge that in a second. However, even among those who reported having a need for mental health services or mental illness or serious mental illness, they are still the least likely to seek mental health care of any kind. And while the COVID pandemic affected everyone, they were disproportionately affected, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. So again, I want to challenge this notion that they have lower rates of mental illness. Do they really? Let's take a look at some facts. So first of all, a lot of the surveys that were conducted regarding mental health are actually only given in English and Spanish, and that further marginalizes this community. And that includes the data I presented at the beginning between 2015 and 2019, a huge study by SAMHSA. They conducted surveys in English and Spanish. So that eliminates a large proportion of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. Also, a lot of surveys, once again, they don't subcategorize API into different nationalities, and that's a disservice. They don't divide them into their cohorts, Japanese, Korean, Chinese, Hawaiian, etc., because mental health and mental illness differ within those populations, within those categories, and it's important to study the trends within them. Also, certain pressures to not report mental illness in the API community exist, some of which include societal pressures to be what's called a model minority. So this idea that they are the minority that's made it, they're the minority that's arrived, they're the minority to look up to, they have to be well put, successful, they have to be always essentially perfect. This is a societal pressure that really is put into Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. There's also family pressures to be successful, to be competent, to be high achieving, and a lot of times these are unrealistic expectations or pressures that are carried throughout their entire lives. It's also culturally very taboo to discuss mental health within a lot of these cultures for a lot of reasons, and we'll talk a little bit more about these reasons, but these range from religious reasons to just traditional reasons. A psychiatrist from Harvard, Dr. Jeffrey Liu, did a great job describing this stigma, and he said that for some Asian Americans, there's a real sense that your value as a person depends on your ability to take care of your family and your community. So if that is gone, that ability to care for them because you have an emotional breakdown, you have a mental illness, or you have any sense of weakness, any signs of being unable to fulfill that role, then your value as a person goes down. It's directly tied to your self-worth. So that's a huge thing to take away from that. And that's very unique, really, to API communities. There's a lot of cultures that don't talk about mental health. There is a lot of stigma that exists throughout almost every culture. I mean, I would argue every culture has some sort of stigma that doesn't allow this topic to even come up. But within Asian American and Pacific Islander cultures, this is huge. That's a big, big stigma. Also, some facts. Did you know that Asian American elderly women actually have the highest suicide rates out of all women over 65? And that among Southeast Asian refugee communities, trauma, violence, the struggles of resettlement cause conditions, some of which include, just to name a few, PTSD and depression. Asian American students, whether they're undergrads or graduate students, are actually also at the highest risk for something called imposter syndrome, which again is kind of related to this model minority idea, or this idea that they have to be perfect. Imposter syndrome being this idea that they aren't what everyone perceives them to be. They truly aren't as great, that they're faking it, that they're not really as wonderful as everybody thinks they are, that they're being put on a pedestal that they can never reach. And that idea, that syndrome, is a strong predictor of adverse mental health conditions. Also, Asian immigrants, and again, this kind of goes back to the study that we talked about, Asian immigrants who feel discriminated against in the US experience depressive symptoms at higher rates than those who did not experience discrimination. So, and again, with the resurgence of a lot of this, or at least the increased rates of a lot of discrimination during the pandemic, I mean, those rates of depressive symptoms and suicidality increased substantially. So we saw a reflection of that. So really, let's summarize once again, now that we've gathered a little bit more data. So due to multiple complex societal, cultural, and familial norms, deeply ingrained stereotypes, as well as limited data and poor study designs, it really is unclear how many API actually have mental illness. That being said, among API who have the courage and awareness to report having a need for mental health services, a mental illness, or a serious mental illness, they are the least likely to seek mental health care of any kind. And once again, the COVID pandemic just made everything worse. So really, they are the definition of a minority in mental health care. They are that group in a subset of individuals who need or seek mental health care, who is less likely to obtain or maintain adequate mental health care for a number of factors. All right, so to conclude, what can we do? What are the solutions as mental health care providers, as peers, as colleagues? What can we do about this? One, we can do our part to decrease the stigma and spread awareness. We won't be able to do this by ourselves, and this won't be easy in general. This will take time, but there's a lot of things that we can do to decrease the stigma and spread awareness. One thing that we can do is spread resources. So there's actually a lot of resources available for Asian American and Pacific Islanders for their mental health. One of which is the Asian American Psychological Association, and they have a lot of resources themselves for mental health. One of which is a provider directory that connects API patients with providers who look like them, who can speak their language, who are culturally competent or culturally aware. And this is a big deal. This not only connects those patients to those providers, but it can decrease the stigma. If you see someone who looks like you, talks like you, acts like you, who understands you and your heritage, your culture, talking about mental health, providing those services, that's a big thing. There's also the National Asian American and Pacific Islander Mental Health Association, and they too have a lot of resources, and they too have a directory with providers who are Asian American. And regardless, you don't have to be Asian American or Pacific Islander to see these patients, to have these conversations. And I'll talk a little bit more about other things that we can do, but being able to give them these resources, being able to point to these as tools for them to be able to see that this is a topic that needs to be discussed, that this is something normal, this doesn't need to be stigmatized, that's a big thing. Another great resource is NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, and actually they have a great section of their website dedicated to Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, and it has a lot of data, a lot of information, and when you scroll down, a lot of resources for Asian American and Pacific Islanders specifically, some of which are in their native languages, in different Asian or Pacific Islander languages, and that's really great. Lots of resources there. The second thing we can do is create mental health care incentives, posts, events, targeting these minorities. So what better time to do that than National Asian American and Pacific Islander Month? So something that I did on my website is put a banner celebrating this culture or this, cluster of cultures, and offering 50% off for those patients during the month of May. Posting things on social media that are specific to this cohort of people, and trying to also destigmatize, trying to at the same time raise awareness. You can also post these sources and target those minorities that way. The third thing we can do is provide culturally competent care, and that really at the core of that is understanding your patient, and understanding too that Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, their idea of medicine might differ from Western medicine. It might also include Eastern medicine. It might also include things like Tai Chi, meditation, yoga. It could be a little bit more comprehensive and include diet, group therapies, exercise, acupuncture, things like that. So keep in mind and get to know that patient, get to know that person, see what they're seeking. Part of the reason they might not be seeking the help that is available here is that maybe they have a different idea of what they need and what they want. And some of those stigmas, structural barriers are directly tied to the fact that what they're looking for might be a little bit different. So keep that in mind, get to know your patient and know that there's a lot of options, and provide that to them, and make sure that you're providing culturally competent care. And lastly, we can do our part to make mental health care more accessible, affordable, and attractive. Going back to this graph, remember that cost. We talked about stigma and structural barriers. Those are the big three. The big three reasons why mental health services were not utilized by this minority. And that's something that we can affect. Again, you can provide incentives, provide even discounts to these minorities, especially during the month in which we're celebrating them. You can incorporate things like telehealth or find technologies that can make these services more accessible, whether that is social media or otherwise. You can let patients know like Medicaid patients, that there are services available that can give them transportation to be able to reach their appointments, to be able to access the care that they need. And these resources are completely free. And just provide these resources to your patients so that they know that these structural barriers can be overcome. Maybe even have a translator or have materials in different languages so that you can reach this population as well. So those are just some things that we can do, some things to keep in mind, but really one big thing is raising awareness, decreasing the stigma, especially in this population. And that's it. So I hope you guys enjoyed. Let me know if you have any questions, and we're going to go over those questions that you guys answered earlier in the session.